They thought facial recognition was just a computer skill, that if she worked quietly in the tech department, she was just another analyst staring at screens all day. So when Director Kyle Brennan slapped corporate security specialist Jade Kelloway across the face in front of the entire quarterly board meeting, he thought he'd proven his point. No pushback, no outburst, no immediate consequence. She just adjusted her glasses, gathered her presentation materials, and walked out of the Northridge Corporate Tower conference room in complete silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what no one in that mahogany-paneled room knew was that Jade didn't just analyze faces on monitors. She cataloged them, cross-referenced them, and once a face entered her memory, it never left. By the time Brennan realized his mistake, by the time he discovered exactly whose past he'd just awakened, the entire Meridian Industries executive team would learn what happens when you humiliate someone who spent 8 years in Naval Special Warfare, someone whose job was to never, ever forget a face. Now, before we reveal exactly what Brennan had overlooked in her background check, and what happened when those forgotten skills suddenly became very relevant, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Drop a comment telling us what you would have done in that situation, and stay right here because this wasn't about revenge. This was about recognition. The fluorescent lights in conference room 12A hummed with an electronic persistence that seemed to match the tension building around the oval table. Jade Kelloway stood at the front of the room, a wireless presentation remote in her left hand, her navy blazer perfectly pressed despite the early morning start. Behind her, the wall-mounted display showed a clean, professional slide. Meridian Industries Security Protocol Enhancement, Phase 3 Implementation. Her voice carried the measured cadence of someone accustomed to briefing rooms, though these corporate executives didn't know she'd once delivered intelligence reports to Joint Task Force commanders in conditions far more hostile than air-conditioned comfort. The facial recognition upgrade will integrate seamlessly with our existing perimeter systems, she explained, clicking to the next slide. Processing speed increases by 340%, with accuracy rates exceeding 99.7% in controlled lighting conditions. 12 board members sat around the polished table, a mix of gray suits and calculated attention. Most took notes on tablets or legal pads. A few checked phones discreetly under the table. Director Kyle Brennan, however, lounged back in his chair near the head of the table, arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who'd already made up his mind before the presentation began. Brennan was the kind of man who mistook volume for authority and interruption for insight. At 52, he'd climbed Meridian's corporate ladder through strategic networking and an ability to claim credit for other people's innovations. His corner office was decorated with awards that bore his name, but represented work done by teams he'd supervised from a comfortable distance. These improvements, Jade continued, will reduce false positives by 67%, while expanding our database integration capabilities across all 7 facility locations. She clicked again. The slide displayed a network diagram showing interconnected security nodes across Meridian's regional offices. Brennan shifted forward, his voice cutting across her explanation. Ms. Kelloway, can we skip the technical jargon? Bottom line, how much is this going to cost, and why can't our current system handle whatever you think we need? Jade paused, not out of uncertainty, but because she recognized the tone. She'd heard it before in briefing rooms, where certain officers felt the need to establish dominance rather than gather information. The total implementation cost is outlined in the executive summary distributed yesterday, she replied evenly. Current systems lack the processing architecture to handle expanded threat identification protocols. Threat identification? Brennan's laugh carried a condescending edge. We're a logistics company, not the Pentagon. Are you suggesting our delivery drivers pose some kind of security risk? A few nervous chuckles rippled around the table. Jade's expression didn't change. The system upgrades address multiple vectors, including unauthorized access attempts, vendor verification, and integration with federal watch list databases. The technology exists. The question is whether Meridian wants to stay ahead of security trends or respond to them after incidents occur. Brennan stood up, his chair rolling backward. Here's what I think, Ms. Kelloway. I think you're trying to justify an expensive toy by creating problems that don't exist. We've had exactly 0 security breaches in 18 months. Our current cameras work fine. Maybe instead of reinventing the wheel, you should focus on systems that actually impact our bottom line. The room grew quieter. Other board members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the shift from professional disagreement to something more personal. Jade set the remote down on the presentation podium. Director Brennan, the recommendation is based on comprehensive threat assessment and industry best practices. The data supports... The data, Brennan interrupted, taking 2 steps closer, supports whatever conclusion you want it to support. That's the problem with people like you. You hide behind technical specifications instead of real-world business sense. People like me? Jade's voice remained level, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Analysts who think they understand operations because they can read a manual. Brennan was now standing directly in front of her, close enough that his voice didn't need to carry across the room. You sit in your little tech corner, playing with computers, thinking that gives you insight into how this company actually functions. The silence in the room had weight now. Board members stopped pretending to take notes. Director Brennan, Jade said quietly, if you have specific concerns about the proposal, we can address them systematically. The technical specifications are documented. The cost analysis is transparent, and the implementation timeline is flexible based on operational priorities. Brennan's face flushed slightly. He'd wanted an argument, a breakdown, some kind of emotional response he could point to as proof of unprofessionalism. Instead, he'd received calm, methodical responses that made his interruptions look increasingly inappropriate. That's when he made the choice that would change everything. You know what your problem is, he said, stepping even closer. You don't know when to quit talking. And then he slapped her, sharp, deliberate, loud enough that the sound echoed off the conference room windows. The room sucked in its breath collectively. Not a whisper, not a murmur. An actual audible gasp from 12 witnesses who couldn't quite process what they'd just seen. Jade's head turned slightly with the impact, her glasses shifting on her nose. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The only sound was the persistent hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then, with movements as precise as her presentation slides, Jade reached up and adjusted her glasses back into position. She picked up her remote, clicked off the projector, and began gathering her materials from the podium. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She simply began packing up with the methodical efficiency of someone who had finished what she came to do. Meeting adjourned, she said, not to Brennan, but to the room in general. Then she walked out, her heels clicking against the polished floor in perfect rhythm, the conference room door closing behind her with a soft but final click. Behind her, 12 board members sat in stunned silence, staring at Director Brennan, who was only just beginning to realize that he might have made a very serious mistake. The executive wing of Northridge Corporate Tower carried the hushed efficiency of power held quietly. Marble floors reflected recessed lighting, and the walls displayed abstract art that cost more than most people's annual salaries. But in the hours following the conference room incident, something felt different. Conversations stopped when footsteps approached. Glances lingered longer than usual. Word traveled fast in corporate environments, faster when it involved something nobody quite knew how to process. Jade Kelloway's office sat on the 14th floor, tucked away in the technology operations wing where most executives rarely ventured. Unlike the mahogany and leather of the upper floors, her workspace was functional. Dual monitors, reference manuals lined neatly on metal shelving, and a small corner dedicated to technical certifications that few people ever bothered to read closely. If they had, they might have noticed credentials that seemed unusual for a corporate security analyst: advanced tactical intelligence systems, joint personnel recovery, maritime special operations, facial recognition and target identification, classified operations certified. But those certificates hung between routine IT documentation and software licensing agreements, easy to overlook if you weren't looking for them. Most of Meridian's leadership team knew Jade as the quiet tech specialist who upgraded their camera systems and ran security protocols with minimal fuss. Efficient, reliable, unremarkable, exactly the way she preferred it. What they didn't know was that before she analyzed faces on corporate security monitors, she had identified high-value targets in environments where mistakes meant lives lost. Before she processed employee badge photos and vendor credentials, she had memorized terrorist cell networks and tracked wanted individuals across 3 continents. Before she worked in climate-controlled office buildings, she had operated in conditions that tested every limit of human endurance. Jade's transition to civilian life had been intentional, methodical. After 8 years in Naval Special Warfare, specifically assigned to intelligence support activity operations, she had chosen corporate security work because it allowed her to use familiar skills in an environment that wouldn't trigger the hypervigilance that had kept her alive overseas. Facial recognition software felt manageable after years of identifying threats in crowds where hesitation meant casualties. The injury that ended her military career wasn't dramatic. No explosion, no firefight, just a parachuting accident during a routine training exercise that left her with chronic back issues incompatible with the physical demands of special operations. The Navy had offered her analyst positions, intelligence coordination roles that would have kept her within the military structure. But Jade had chosen differently. She wanted distance from the world, where faces and databases represented life or death decisions. At Meridian Industries, faces were just employees and visitors and delivery personnel. Corporate security meant preventing theft and managing access cards, not tracking international fugitives or identifying combatants in hostile territory. The skills translated perfectly, but the stakes felt manageable. Director Kyle Brennan represented everything she'd hoped to leave behind in military hierarchies. The kind of leader who confused authority with competence, who demanded respect without earning it, who made decisions based on ego rather than evidence. In her SEAL teams, such men rarely lasted long. The operational environment corrected arrogance quickly and definitively, but corporate structures protected them, allowed them to fail upward while blaming subordinates for problems they created. Brennan had joined Meridian 3 years earlier, recruited from a competitor with promises of modernizing their logistics operations. His background was traditional business school, MBA, from a prestigious program, previous positions at companies where he'd managed large teams and overseen significant budgets. On paper, he looked perfect for Meridian's expansion plans. In practice, he had shown consistent patterns of taking credit for successful projects while distancing himself from failures. His management style relied heavily on intimidation disguised as high standards. He surrounded himself with subordinates who agreed rather than advised, creating an information bubble that reinforced his assumptions while filtering out inconvenient realities. The facial recognition upgrade project had been Jade's initiative, born from her observation that Meridian's current security systems were vulnerable to sophisticated infiltration attempts. She'd identified 17 specific weaknesses in their perimeter protocols and vendor verification processes. The proposed upgrade would close those gaps while integrating with federal databases that could flag individuals on various watch lists. For Jade, it was a straightforward technical improvement based on identified vulnerabilities and available solutions. For Brennan, it represented an expensive project championed by someone he viewed as expendable, threatening his quarterly budget metrics and potentially highlighting security deficiencies that occurred under his oversight. The presentation had been scheduled after weeks of preliminary meetings where Brennan had grown increasingly hostile to the project. He'd questioned the cost, criticized the implementation timeline, and suggested that Jade was inflating problems to justify unnecessary technology. But today's meeting was meant to be the final approval, with board members present to authorize the budget allocation. Jade had prepared meticulously as she always did. Every slide contained verifiable data. Every recommendation was supported by documentation. Every cost projection included multiple scenarios with conservative estimates. She'd approached it like a military briefing where lives depended on accuracy and clarity. What she hadn't anticipated was that Brennan would treat the presentation as a personal challenge rather than a professional discussion, that he would interpret her technical expertise as insubordination, that he would respond to her competence with the kind of dominance display that belonged in a different era, a different environment, a different world than the one she thought she'd chosen. But as Jade sat in her office that afternoon, staring at the certificates on her wall that represented skills she'd hoped never to use again, she realized that some things never really changed. Some people never learned, and some faces, once they crossed certain lines, needed to be remembered for reasons that had nothing to do with corporate security databases. Outside her window, the sun began its descent toward the Pacific horizon, casting long shadows across the Northridge business district. The building grew quieter as day-shift employees headed home, leaving behind the skeleton crews that monitored systems and secured facilities through the night. Jade opened her desk drawer and retrieved a small locked metal box that had sat untouched since her first day at Meridian. Inside, beneath routine office supplies and backup access cards, lay a single item she'd kept from her previous life. Not a weapon, not a tool, just a reminder of capabilities that never fully disappeared, only waited dormant until circumstances required their activation. She held the item briefly, feeling its familiar weight, then returned it to the drawer. Some decisions required careful consideration, some responses demanded precise timing, and some people needed to learn that certain faces, once they've seen enough, never forget anything at all. The quarterly board meeting had been scheduled to end at 10:30 a.m., followed by light refreshments in the adjacent hospitality suite. Instead, at 10:17 a.m., 12 board members sat frozen around a mahogany table, staring at the spot where Jade Kelloway had been standing moments before. The projector screen still glowed with her final slide, technical specifications hanging in the air like evidence of a conversation that had derailed completely. Director Kyle Brennan remained standing near the head of the table, his right hand still tingling from the contact. The sound of the slap seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed, bouncing off the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Northridge business district, 14 stories below. Board Chairman Richard Ashworth broke the silence first, his voice careful and measured. "Kyle, what exactly just happened here?" Brennan's response came too quickly, with the forced confidence of someone who hadn't yet processed the magnitude of his mistake. She was being insubordinate, argumentative. Sometimes you have to establish clear boundaries with subordinates who forget their place in the hierarchy. Patricia Valdez, Meridian's chief legal counsel, set down her pen with deliberate precision. She'd been taking notes throughout the presentation, but her focus had shifted entirely to what she'd just witnessed. "Kyle, you just physically assaulted an employee during a formal board meeting in front of 12 witnesses. There are no boundaries that justify that response." "Assault?" Brennan's laugh sounded hollow even to himself. It was a corrective gesture. She needed to understand that her attitude was inappropriate for this environment. Around the table, expressions ranged from shock to disgust to the careful neutrality of people calculating political implications. Vice President of Operations Michael Torres leaned forward, his voice low. "Kyle, that woman just delivered the most comprehensive security analysis I've seen in 20 years with this company. Her attitude was professional. Her data was solid. What exactly did you find inappropriate?" Brennan felt the room shifting against him, but couldn't seem to stop talking. "She was challenging my authority, questioning my business judgment, acting like she knew better than experienced management." "She was answering your questions," said board member Linda Chen, her tone ice cold. "You asked about costs. She provided documentation. You questioned the necessity. She explained the vulnerabilities. You criticized her expertise, and she maintained professional composure. The only inappropriate behavior I witnessed was yours." Financial Director James Morrison, who had remained silent through most presentations over his 8 years on the board, spoke without looking up from his notes. "Kyle, I've been reviewing her background file since she started speaking. Did you actually read her personnel records?" "Of course I read her file. Tech specialist, security systems, previous government work, standard background for this type of position." Morrison turned his tablet toward the center of the table, displaying Jade's employment application. Previous government work. "Kyle, she was Naval Special Warfare for 8 years. Intelligence support activity. That's not previous government work, that's elite special operations. She's got commendations from Joint Task Force commanders and classified operations certifications." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Brennan's confident posture wavered as the implications began penetrating his anger. That doesn't change anything. Military background doesn't give anyone license to be disrespectful in corporate environments. Patricia Valdez was already typing on her laptop, accessing Meridian's legal database. "Kyle, we have mandatory training on workplace conduct. We have explicit policies about physical contact with employees. We have documentation requirements for any disciplinary actions. What you just did violates every single protocol we have in place." Chairman Ashworth stood up, signaling the end of whatever patience had been sustaining the conversation. "This meeting is concluded. Kyle, you'll remain here while we contact Human Resources and Legal. Everyone else, please consider this discussion confidential pending formal review." Board members began filing out, but their whispered conversations were anything but confidential. The story was already spreading through the executive wing before the conference room door fully closed. Down in the technology operations wing, Jade's direct supervisor, IT manager David Rodriguez, had been tracking network performance metrics when his phone buzzed with a text message from a friend in facilities management. "Something big just happened in the board meeting. Your tech specialist just walked out looking like ice." Rodriguez immediately tried calling Jade's extension. No answer. He walked to her office and found the door closed, which was unusual. She typically kept it open during business hours. He knocked gently. "Jade, everything okay?" Her voice came through the door, calm and professional, as always. "I'm fine, David. Just updating some system documentation. The board presentation concluded earlier than expected." "Do you need anything? Linda from finance mentioned seeing you in the elevator looking focused." There was a pause before Jade responded. "I appreciate the concern. I'm just processing some information that came to light during the meeting. Nothing that affects current operations." Rodriguez knew better than to push. In the 2 years Jade had worked for him, she'd never brought personal drama to work, never missed deadlines, never created problems that required management intervention. If she said she was fine, he trusted her judgment, but something in her tone suggested that fine might be a very relative term. 3 floors up, in the executive administrative wing, Brennan's assistant, Sarah Matthews, was fielding phone calls from board members' offices, requesting copies of Jade's personnel file, the presentation materials, and any documented interactions between Brennan and technology operations staff. The requests were coming with unusual urgency and formal language that suggested legal review rather than routine business. Sarah had worked for Brennan for 18 months, long enough to recognize when his confidence was genuine versus when it was compensatory. The phone call she'd received from Chairman Ashworth's office, requesting Brennan's availability for an immediate meeting with legal and human resources, suggested that his post-meeting bravado might be misplaced. In the building's security control room, Senior Guard Marcus Johnson was reviewing the morning's access logs when his partner pointed to one of the monitor banks. "Hey, isn't that the tech lady from 14? She's been sitting in her office for 2 hours without moving, just staring at her computer screen." Johnson glanced at the monitor showing Jade's office. She sat perfectly still, hands folded on her desk, looking at something on her screen with the kind of focused intensity he'd seen in military personnel. "Maybe she's analyzing something complex. Tech people do that." "For 2 hours without moving, without even checking her phone?" Johnson zoomed the camera slightly. Jade's posture was precisely upright. Her breathing appeared steady, her expression completely neutral, but there was something about her stillness that seemed different from concentration, more like calculation. "Leave her alone," Johnson said finally. "If she wants privacy, she's earned it. Besides, something tells me interrupting her right now wouldn't be the smartest career move either of us could make." Meanwhile, in conference room 12A, Kyle Brennan sat alone at the mahogany table, staring at the presentation screen that still displayed Jade's technical specifications. For the first time since the confrontation, he was beginning to understand that he might have seriously underestimated the person he'd just humiliated. And somewhere in the back of his mind, an uncomfortable question was starting to form. Exactly what kind of training did Naval Special Warfare personnel receive? And how much of it might be relevant outside of military contexts? The answer to that question was walking toward the elevator bank on the 14th floor, carrying a small metal box and wearing the expression of someone who had just made a very important decision about the immediate future. The word spread through Northridge Corporate Tower with the viral efficiency that only workplace scandals could achieve. By noon, 3 versions of the conference room incident were circulating through different departments, each iteration shaped by the storyteller's proximity to power and their personal relationship with the key players. In the marketing department on the 7th floor, Administrative Coordinator Lisa Park was explaining her understanding to a cluster of colleagues near the copy machines. Apparently, she completely froze up when Brennan called her out on the budget numbers, just stood there like a deer in headlights until he had to physically snap her out of it. I heard she didn't say a single word afterward, just packed up, and left. Her version painted Jade as overwhelmed and unprepared, unable to defend her proposals when challenged by experienced leadership. It was the interpretation that made the most sense to people who viewed corporate presentations as gladiatorial contests, where only the strongest personalities survived. 2 floors down in accounting, a different narrative was taking shape. Senior financial analyst Robert Chen had attended enough board meetings to recognize political maneuvering when he saw it. Brennan set her up, he told his lunch companions in the break room, asked impossible questions about implementation timelines, then acted like her technical answers were evasive. The whole thing was designed to make her look incompetent so he could kill the project. This version resonated with employees who'd watched Brennan systematically dismantle other initiatives that threatened his budget allocations or required him to admit gaps in his oversight. But in the Security Operations Center on the ground floor, Guard Supervisor Elena Martinez was telling a story that made her colleagues distinctly uncomfortable. "I pulled the access logs from the conference level," she said quietly, checking to make sure they couldn't be overheard. Kelloway's badge shows her leaving that meeting and going straight to her office. She's been there for 4 hours without coming out. No bathroom breaks, no lunch, nothing. And when I checked the personnel database for her background verification, guys, we might have a serious situation developing. Martinez had been a military police officer before transitioning to corporate security. She recognized certain patterns in behavior and documentation that civilian employees might miss. Jade's service record contained just enough detail to be concerning and just enough redaction to be alarming. Meanwhile, in the executive wing, Kyle Brennan was discovering that his version of events was gaining very little traction among the people whose opinions actually mattered for his career trajectory. Chairman Ashworth had requested a private meeting that turned out to be anything but private. Human Resources Director Amanda Foster and Legal Counsel Patricia Valdez had joined them in Ashworth's corner office. "Kyle, walk us through your decision-making process during that presentation," Ashworth said, his tone suggesting this was a formal interview rather than a casual conversation. Brennan attempted to reconstruct his justification, but without the heat of the moment and the supportive audience of his imagination, his reasoning sounded increasingly weak. "She was being disrespectful, challenging my authority in front of the entire board, acting like her technical background made her immune to management oversight." Amanda Foster consulted her notes. "According to the board members I've spoken with, she answered every question you posed, provided documentation for every claim, and maintained professional demeanor throughout. Can you specify which behaviors you interpreted as disrespectful?" "Her attitude, the way she kept correcting my concerns instead of acknowledging them, acting like she knew better than someone with 20 years of corporate leadership experience." Patricia Valdez set down her pen and looked directly at Brennan. "Kyle, correcting factual errors and providing accurate information isn't disrespect, it's competence. And regarding her qualifications to know better, have you actually reviewed her complete personnel file?" Brennan's confidence wavered. "I know her background. Tech specialist, some government work, perfectly qualified for her current position." "Some government work," Valdez repeated slowly. "Kyle, she was Naval Special Warfare intelligence for 8 years. She held security clearances that required psychological evaluations, background investigations, and performance standards that eliminated 90% of candidates. Her tech specialist role here utilizes approximately 15% of her actual skill set." The room grew quiet as the implications settled. Ashworth leaned back in his chair, studying Brennan's expression. "So you physically struck a decorated special operations veteran because you felt she was being disrespectful during a technical presentation?" I didn't know about her military background, Brennan said quickly. That information wasn't highlighted in her standard personnel summary. Kyle, Amanda Foster, interjected, her military background is irrelevant to the fundamental issue. You cannot put your hands on employees regardless of their service history, but understanding her actual qualifications might have prevented you from misinterpreting professional competence as insubordination. Down in the technology wing, David Rodriguez was beginning to understand that his quiet, efficient security specialist might be processing the morning's events through a significantly different framework than typical corporate employees. He'd worked with former military personnel before and recognized certain patterns, the way they compartmentalized problems, analyzed threats, and developed response strategies with methodical precision. He knocked on Jade's office door again, this time with a cup of coffee and a more direct approach. Jade, I need to ask you something straight. Are you planning any kind of formal action regarding what happened in that meeting? Her door opened halfway. She looked calm, focused, but there was something in her eyes that reminded Rodriguez of documentaries he'd seen about special forces operators, a kind of controlled intensity that suggested significant mental processing was occurring behind an unreadable exterior. David, I appreciate your concern. I'm evaluating several options and their potential consequences. Nothing hasty, nothing emotional, nothing that would reflect poorly on the department or compromise ongoing operations. That's not exactly reassuring, Rodriguez said carefully. When someone with your background talks about evaluating options, it makes management nervous. Jade almost smiled at that. It should make management thoughtful, not nervous. I'm not planning anything dramatic. I'm just ensuring that appropriate responses align with appropriate provocations. Rodriguez handed her the coffee. Jade, whatever you're considering, please remember that corporate environments have different rules than other places you might have worked. Different consequences, different standards of resolution. She accepted the coffee and met his eyes directly. I understand the environment, David. I've been observing it for 2 years. I know exactly what kind of place this is, what kind of people succeed here, and what kind of behavior gets overlooked. Today's incident just clarified some things about which category certain individuals belong in. After Rodriguez left, Jade returned to her desk and opened the secure email system that connected Meridian servers to various federal databases. Her security clearance had been transferred to civilian contractor status when she joined the company, allowing her access to identification and verification systems that most corporate employees never knew existed. She began typing a series of queries, each one designed to gather specific information about Kyle Brennan's background, associates, and activities. Nothing illegal, nothing that violated her access privileges, just routine security verification procedures that her position authorized and her training made extremely thorough. Because while Brennan might have forgotten that some faces were worth remembering, Jade had never forgotten that some people were worth investigating. And after 8 years of identifying threats and tracking targets, she was very, very good at finding information that people preferred to keep hidden. The investigation would take time, precision, and patience, but Jade had all three in abundance, along with access to resources that most people never imagined existed in corporate environments. By evening, Kyle Brennan would discover that slapping someone was the easy part. Living with the consequences of who you'd chosen to slap, that was where things became complicated. By 3 p.m., the story had metastasized beyond the confines of Northridge Corporate Tower and taken on a life of its own across the broader Meridian Industries network. In the company's satellite offices, scattered throughout the region, employees who had never heard of Jade Kelloway were suddenly experts on what had happened during a board meeting they hadn't attended. At the Riverside Logistics Center, Warehouse supervisor Tom Bradley was holding court during the afternoon shift change, his version of events heavily influenced by his personal dislike of corporate oversight. Some pencil pusher from headquarters tried to lecture the board about spending millions on fancy cameras. When the director called her out on wasting company money, she had a complete meltdown, started crying, threw her papers around, ran out of the meeting like a child. His audience of dock workers and drivers nodded knowingly. They'd all dealt with corporate consultants who arrived with expensive solutions to problems that didn't exist, armed with PowerPoint presentations and disconnected from operational reality. The image of an entitled headquarters analyst getting publicly humbled felt like justice. Meanwhile, at the East Side Customer Service Center, a more sympathetic narrative was developing among the predominantly female staff. Customer Relations Manager Jennifer Walsh had worked in corporate environments long enough to recognize the dynamics of workplace harassment. A woman tries to present a professional proposal, and some executive decides to put her in her place physically. That's not discipline, that's intimidation. And the fact that everyone's making excuses for him shows exactly why these situations keep happening. Her interpretation resonated with employees who'd experienced their own encounters, with men who confused authority with ownership, who treated female colleagues as subordinates regardless of qualifications or position. But the most dangerous version of the story was spreading through Meridian's competitor networks, where corporate intelligence flowed as freely as coffee in break rooms. At Horizon Logistics across town, Senior Vice President Dale Morrison was already calculating how to exploit what sounded like a major internal crisis at Meridian's executive level. If their security director is publicly humiliating staff during board meetings, that suggests serious leadership instability, Morrison told his strategy team during their weekly competitive analysis session. Companies don't survive long when management loses control of basic professional standards. This might be an opportunity to approach some of their key accounts with stability concerns. None of these interpretations bore much resemblance to what had actually occurred in Conference Room 12A, but truth had become secondary to the psychological needs of each audience. People believed the version that confirmed their existing assumptions about corporate power, gender dynamics, military backgrounds, or workplace justice. Back at Northridge Tower, Kyle Brennan was beginning to understand that his greatest challenge wouldn't be the formal HR investigation or potential legal consequences. It would be controlling a narrative that was spinning beyond his influence. His assistant Sarah Matthews had fielded 17 calls from various department heads requesting clarification about rumors ranging from his immediate termination to Jade's supposed nervous breakdown. Brennan attempted to manage the story through strategic conversations with key allies throughout the company. He called Regional Operations Director Frank Castellanos, a longtime supporter who shared his skepticism toward headquarters initiatives. "Frank, I need you to understand what really happened this morning," Brennan began, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to shaping perceptions. "We had a junior analyst trying to railroad the board into approving a multi-million-dollar expenditure without adequate justification. When I pressed her for real answers instead of technical jargon, she became combative and disrespectful. Castellanos, managing 3 distribution centers and constantly battling budget constraints imposed by headquarters, was naturally sympathetic to Brennan's position. These tech people think complexity equals necessity. If she couldn't explain the value proposition in plain English, maybe the project wasn't worth pursuing." Exactly. And when I tried to refocus the discussion on business fundamentals, she acted like questioning her expertise was a personal attack. The situation required immediate correction before she completely undermined the board's authority. Brennan's version of immediate correction omitted certain physical details while emphasizing Jade's supposed unprofessionalism. It was a calculated reframing designed to position him as defending corporate hierarchy rather than losing control of his temper. But while Brennan worked to manage external perceptions, he remained unaware of what Jade was doing with her afternoon. In her 14th floor office, she had spent 3 hours conducting what military intelligence professionals called a background development, the systematic collection and analysis of information about potential threats or targets of interest. Her access to federal databases through Meridian's security contracts allowed her to run comprehensive checks that most civilian employers could never imagine. She wasn't violating any protocols or exceeding her authorization. She was simply being more thorough than anyone expected. The initial search confirmed Brennan's basic background information: education at Northwestern, previous positions at 3 logistics companies, clean credit history, no criminal record, standard corporate executive profile. But Jade's training had taught her to look beyond surface credentials toward patterns and associations that revealed character and potential vulnerabilities. She expanded her search to include Brennan's professional network, examining the companies he'd worked for, the projects he'd overseen, and the circumstances surrounding his career transitions. Military intelligence work required understanding not just who someone was, but how they operated, what motivated them, and where their weaknesses might create operational opportunities. The pattern that emerged was subtle but consistent. At his previous company, Brennan had been promoted twice in 18 months, before leaving abruptly during a period when several female employees had filed harassment complaints. The complaints had been settled internally with non-disclosure agreements, but the timing suggested more than coincidence. At the company before that, he'd overseen a major IT infrastructure upgrade that had failed spectacularly, resulting in millions in cost overruns and system downtime. The official reports blamed vendor incompetence and unforeseeable technical challenges, but the project specifications showed clear evidence of inadequate technical consultation and rushed implementation, exactly the kind of problems that occurred when managers dismissed expert recommendations as unnecessary complexity. Jade cross-referenced these patterns with Brennan's public statements, conference presentations, and industry publications. A picture emerged of someone who consistently prioritized short-term appearances over long-term consequences, who treated technical expertise as threatening rather than valuable, and who had a documented history of conflicts with subordinates who challenged his assumptions. Most concerning was evidence suggesting that Brennan had used his authority to retaliate against employees who exposed problems with his decision-making. Performance reviews mysteriously declined after staff members raised concerns about project management or budget allocations. Promising careers had stalled when individuals became too vocal about operational inefficiencies. As Jade compiled this information, her training kicked in with automatic precision. In special operations, understanding your opposition meant analyzing their capabilities, motivations, and patterns of behavior under pressure. It meant identifying their strengths, weaknesses, and likely responses to various scenarios. Kyle Brennan was beginning to look less like an authority figure who'd lost his temper and more like a systematic problem that had been allowed to persist through organizational inaction and victim isolation. The morning's slap wasn't an aberration. It was an escalation of established patterns. By evening, Jade had assembled a comprehensive profile that would have impressed her former intelligence supervisors. She understood exactly who Kyle Brennan was, how he operated, and what kind of response would be most effective in neutralizing his ability to harm other employees. The only question remaining was timing, and for someone trained in strategic patience, That decision would be made with the same methodical precision that had characterized every other aspect of her analysis. Kyle Brennan had awakened something he didn't understand in someone whose capabilities he'd completely underestimated. The consequences of that mistake were about to become very apparent. The elevator to the parking garage descended through 15 floors of corporate ambition and carefully managed reputations, but Jade Kelloway wasn't thinking about office politics or quarterly projections. As the numbers counted down toward the subterranean levels of Northridge Tower, her mind was processing information with the systematic precision that had once identified terrorist networks and tracked high-value targets across hostile territory. Her Honda Civic sat in space 47B, unremarkable among the sea of mid-range sedans and SUVs that filled the employee section. She'd chosen that car deliberately when she started at Meridian. Reliable, efficient, invisible. The kind of vehicle that attracted no attention from colleagues who might wonder why someone with her background drove something so modest, or why she preferred anonymity to the status symbols that defined success in corporate environments. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But tonight, as she sat behind the wheel with the engine running and the garage's fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows through her windshield, Jade was remembering a different vehicle in a different parking structure. Kandahar Air Base 2019. She'd been part of a joint task force operation targeting a Taliban logistics network that had been moving weapons through seemingly legitimate shipping companies. The breakthrough had come not from satellite imagery or intercepted communications, but from patient analysis of financial records, shipping manifests, and personnel files. Weeks of methodical investigation had revealed patterns that connected legitimate businesses to illegal activities, exposing a network that had operated undetected for 2 years. The mission had succeeded because her team understood that effective operations required 3 elements: accurate intelligence, strategic patience, and precise timing. Rushing led to mistakes. Incomplete information led to mission failure. But when all 3 elements aligned, even the most carefully hidden targets became vulnerable. Kyle Brennan had made himself a target the moment his hand connected with her face, not because the physical contact had injured her. She'd endured far worse during training exercises, but because it revealed the kind of person he was beneath the corporate facade. Someone who used power to humiliate rather than lead. Someone who treated competence as threat rather than asset. Someone who needed to be neutralized before he damaged other people's careers and lives. Jade pulled out of the parking garage and drove toward her apartment in the Marina District, a 1-bedroom unit with views of the harbor that reminded her of operational briefings in coastal locations around the world. The apartment was furnished with the same deliberate simplicity as her office. Functional, clean, no personal photographs or military memorabilia that might prompt questions from casual visitors. But in the bedroom closet, behind a row of business suits and casual clothes, sat a locked storage case that contained items from her previous life. Not weapons or classified materials. Those had been properly transferred or destroyed when she left the service, but operational tools that remained legal for civilian possession and might prove useful in certain circumstances. She opened the case and removed a laptop computer that looked identical to standard consumer models, but contained specialized software designed for intelligence analysis and data correlation. The programs weren't classified, but they weren't available through normal commercial channels either. They were the kind of tools that former special operations personnel sometimes retained for consulting work or private security contracts. Jade connected the laptop to a secure VPN and began uploading the information she'd gathered about Brennan during the afternoon. The software automatically cross-referenced his background data with public records, social media activity, professional associations, and financial disclosures. Within minutes, a comprehensive network map appeared on her screen, showing connections, patterns, and anomalies that human analysis might miss. The results were more extensive than she'd expected. Brennan's professional network included individuals with questionable backgrounds, a former business partner who'd been investigated for securities fraud, a college roommate currently facing embezzlement charges, a consulting firm that specialized in helping executives avoid accountability for operational failures. More concerning were the financial irregularities embedded in Meridian's recent project budgets. Brennan had consistently favored vendors who offered higher costs but provided what appeared to be kickback arrangements through consulting fees and speaking engagements. The facial recognition upgrade he'd opposed would have required competitive bidding that might expose these cozy relationships. Jade's training had taught her to recognize corruption networks and the behavioral patterns that sustained them. Brennan wasn't just an abusive manager. He was potentially involved in financial misconduct that could expose Meridian to legal liability and regulatory sanctions. She opened a new analysis window and began mapping the decision-making processes that had characterized Brennan's tenure at Meridian. Project cancellations, vendor selections, personnel decisions, budget allocations, everything followed patterns that benefited his personal interests while creating operational inefficiencies and ethical vulnerabilities. The slap in the conference room suddenly looked different, not an isolated moment of poor judgment, but part of a broader pattern of using intimidation to suppress scrutiny of his activities. How many other employees had been silenced through similar tactics? How many legitimate concerns had been dismissed through retaliation and humiliation? Jade leaned back in her chair and considered her options. She could file a formal harassment complaint and trust the corporate system to investigate and resolve the situation appropriately. Based on her research into Meridian's track record with such complaints, that approach had approximately a 30% success rate and typically resulted in settlements that protected the company's reputation while allowing problematic executives to continue operating. She could pursue legal action through external attorneys, which might result in financial compensation, but would likely take months or years to resolve while Brennan continued affecting other employees. Or she could handle the situation using skills and resources that Kyle Brennan couldn't anticipate, understand, or counter effectively. Military intelligence operations succeeded because they leveraged superior information and strategic thinking against opponents who relied on conventional approaches. Corporate environments operated under similar principles. Most conflicts were resolved through political maneuvering, legal procedures, or informal negotiations. Very few people expected responses that drew from special operations methodologies. Jade opened her contacts list and scrolled to a name she hadn't called in 18 months. Marcus Webb, former Navy intelligence officer who now worked as a private investigative consultant specializing in corporate fraud cases. Webb had access to databases and analytical resources that complemented her own capabilities. Webb Investigations, this is Marcus. Marcus, it's Jade Kelloway. I need some research assistance on a priority basis. Webb's tone immediately shifted to professional attention. Jade, good to hear from you. What's the situation? Corporate executive with patterns suggesting financial misconduct and employee intimidation. I need comprehensive background development and network analysis. Legal parameters, but thorough scope. Timeline? 48 hours for initial findings, 1 week for complete package. Understood. Send me what you have, and I'll get started tonight. Are we talking about prevention or response? Jade considered the question carefully. Response with prevention elements. The target has escalated beyond acceptable parameters and needs immediate correction. Copy that, Jade, just so I'm clear. Are we staying within civilian legal frameworks? Completely. This is intelligence gathering and strategic pressure, nothing that crosses ethical or legal boundaries. Just leveraging information advantages against someone who's been operating with impunity. After ending the call, Jade walked to her kitchen and prepared a simple dinner while her mind continued processing the day's events. Outside her window, the harbor lights reflected off calm water, creating patterns that reminded her of navigation charts she'd studied during maritime operations. Kyle Brennan had made a fundamental error in judgment when he chose to physically assault someone whose background he'd never bothered to investigate. He'd assumed that corporate hierarchies protected him from consequences and that intimidation would resolve conflicts in his favor. Within 48 hours, he would discover that some people possessed resources and capabilities that existed entirely outside the corporate systems he understood. And by the time he realized his mistake, the correction process would already be irreversibly in motion. Jade finished her dinner and began preparing for a very productive weekend. Monday morning arrived at Northridge Corporate Tower with the artificial energy that caffeine and ambition pumped through its ventilation systems. The weekend had provided a brief respite from the tension that had permeated the building since Friday's board meeting, but by 8 a.m., the whispered conversations and sideways glances had resumed with renewed intensity. What most employees didn't realize was that while they'd spent their weekend speculating about consequences and career implications, Jade Kelloway had spent hers constructing a trap with the precision of someone trained to eliminate targets without leaving fingerprints. The elevator carried her to the 14th floor with its familiar mechanical rhythm, but today she carried herself differently, not obviously. The change was subtle enough that casual observers might not notice. Her posture remained professional, her expression calm, her pace measured. But for those trained to recognize such things, there was a shift in energy that suggested someone moving from defensive positioning to active engagement. Marcus Webb had delivered exactly what she'd requested: a comprehensive analysis of Kyle Brennan's professional network, financial activities, and operational patterns that revealed vulnerabilities her initial research had only hinted at. The weekend investigation had uncovered enough irregularities to interest federal regulatory agencies, enough ethical violations to concern Meridian's board of directors, and enough documented evidence to support multiple formal complaints. But Jade's plan didn't involve external agencies or formal complaints. Her approach would be far more elegant and infinitely more devastating to someone who valued power and reputation above everything else. She began with a simple email sent from her standard corporate account to the Distribution Planning Committee, a routine internal group that coordinated logistics between Meridian's various facilities. The subject line read, "Security Protocol Enhancement, Vendor Verification Update." The message appeared completely innocuous, discussing upcoming improvements to contractor screening procedures and enhanced background verification systems. Buried within the technical specifications, however, were references to historical contract analysis and retroactive compliance auditing that would have specific meaning to anyone familiar with the vendor relationships that Marcus Webb's investigation had flagged. The email was copied to 17 recipients, including 3 board members who served on the audit committee, 2 regional managers who worked closely with Brennan's preferred contractors, and the chief financial officer who signed off on vendor payments. None of them would immediately recognize the significance of the technical language, but the information would become relevant very soon. Jade's second action was scheduling a meeting with IT Director David Rodriguez, under the pretense of discussing security system updates. During that conversation, she would casually mention that the new facial recognition software could be tested using historical footage from various company events and meetings, including the quarterly board sessions that were routinely recorded for legal compliance purposes. The system's pattern recognition capabilities are quite sophisticated, she would explain to Rodriguez. It can analyze micro-expressions, stress indicators, and behavioral anomalies that might be missed during live observation. We could use existing footage to benchmark the software's accuracy before full implementation. Rodriguez would approve the testing without hesitation, not realizing that Friday's board meeting footage would provide devastating evidence of Brennan's conduct when viewed through advanced analytical software that could measure emotional states, aggression levels, and psychological indicators with scientific precision. The third element of her plan involved a conversation with Patricia Valdez, Meridian's chief legal counsel, ostensibly regarding data privacy protocols for the new security systems. During that discussion, Jade would express concerns about ensuring compliance with federal regulations regarding employee monitoring and information security. Given the sensitive nature of the data we'll be processing, she would mention, I want to ensure our procedures align with federal guidelines for classified contractor work. My security clearance includes briefings on requirements that most corporate environments don't typically encounter. This conversation would serve two purposes: establishing her credibility as someone familiar with federal compliance standards, and introducing the possibility that Meridian's current practices might not meet the scrutiny that government contracts required. But the most crucial element of her plan was a meeting request sent to Kyle Brennan himself, scheduled for Thursday afternoon in his corner office. The subject line read, Facial Recognition Project, Revised Implementation Strategy. The message was professional and deferential, suggesting that she had reconsidered the project scope based on his feedback from Friday's presentation and wanted to discuss modifications that would address his budgetary concerns. It included references to alternative approaches that better align with operational priorities and cost reduction strategies that maintain essential functionality. Brennan would interpret this as capitulation, evidence that his confrontational approach had achieved the desired result of forcing her to compromise her position. He would schedule the meeting expecting to receive a scaled-down proposal that reflected his authority and validated his judgment. What he wouldn't anticipate was that the meeting would occur in his office, where the executive-level security cameras possessed audio recording capabilities that captured everything said within range of the desk area. Cameras that Jade had personally calibrated during the security system installation 18 months earlier. Nor would he expect that by Thursday afternoon, 3 board members would have received anonymous tips about potential vendor irregularities that warranted investigation. The audit committee would be reviewing contract approvals that showed suspicious patterns, and the legal department would be examining federal compliance issues that could expose the company to regulatory sanctions. The meeting would give Brennan an opportunity to demonstrate exactly who he was when he thought he was winning. And this time, every word would be recorded with high-definition clarity by systems that he didn't understand and couldn't control. Jade spent Monday morning implementing each element of her plan with the methodical precision that had once coordinated multi-phase operations across hostile territory. Every email was sent at precisely calculated intervals, every conversation timed to build upon previous interactions, every piece of information positioned where it would have maximum impact when the moment arrived. By noon, the first phase was complete. The trap was set, the pressure points were identified, and the timing sequence was in motion. Kyle Brennan remained unaware that his world was about to change fundamentally, that the woman he'd slapped on Friday was now controlling the battlefield with advantages he couldn't perceive or counter. Tuesday would bring the first signs that something was shifting in his environment. Wednesday would introduce complications that challenged his confidence, and Thursday would provide him with a final opportunity to reveal exactly who he was when he thought he held all the power. After that, the system would correct itself with the efficiency that only superior intelligence and strategic thinking could achieve. Kyle Brennan had awakened capabilities he didn't understand in someone whose training had prepared her to neutralize threats, using methods that left no trace of external intervention. The correction was already in motion. He just didn't know it yet. Thursday afternoon arrived with the kind of gray overcast that made Northridge's glass towers look like monoliths emerging from fog. By 3 p.m., Kyle Brennan sat behind his executive desk, reviewing what he believed would be Jade Kelloway's surrender, a revised proposal that acknowledged his superior business judgment and scaled back her ambitious security upgrade to something more reasonable. The week had unfolded exactly as he'd expected. No formal complaints had been filed, no HR investigations had materialized, and no consequences had emerged from Friday's corrective action. If anything, his standing within the company seemed strengthened. Several regional managers had reached out to congratulate him on standing firm against unnecessary spending, and his lunch meeting with Chairman Ashworth on Tuesday had focused entirely on budget optimization rather than personnel issues. Brennan's confidence had been further reinforced by Jade's email requesting this meeting. The tone had been appropriately deferential, acknowledging his concerns and expressing willingness to reconsider implementation strategies that better align with operational priorities. It was exactly the kind of capitulation he'd been seeking, proof that decisive leadership could resolve personnel problems without involving bureaucratic procedures. When Jade knocked on his office door at exactly 3 p.m., Brennan was prepared to be magnanimous in victory. He would accept her revised proposal graciously, perhaps even acknowledge her technical competence, while emphasizing the importance of budgetary discipline. The meeting would conclude with clear understanding of corporate hierarchy and his role in maintaining it. "Ms. Kelloway, please come in," he said, gesturing toward the leather chair positioned in front of his desk. "I appreciate you taking the initiative to address the concerns I raised last week." Jade entered carrying a tablet and a thin portfolio, her demeanor professional but noticeably more subdued than during the board presentation. She took the offered seat and placed her materials on the small side table, then folded her hands in her lap with a posture that suggested respectful attention. "Director Brennan, I've spent considerable time reviewing your feedback and analyzing alternative approaches that might better serve Meridian's objectives," she began, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had learned appropriate lessons about corporate communication. Brennan leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the dynamic he was observing. "I'm pleased to hear that. Sometimes these technical proposals need to be grounded in business realities before they can move forward effectively." "Absolutely. I realize my initial presentation may have emphasized technological capabilities without adequately addressing implementation challenges and cost considerations." Jade opened her tablet and displayed what appeared to be a simplified diagram. This revised approach focuses on core functionality while eliminating the more expensive features that might not provide immediate value. For the next 15 minutes, she walked through a proposal that seemed perfectly calibrated to his preferences. Lower costs, reduced complexity, implementation timeline that aligned with existing budget cycles. Brennan found himself nodding approvingly as she addressed each concern he'd raised during the board meeting. "This is much more reasonable," he said when she finished. It demonstrates exactly the kind of practical thinking I was hoping to see. Technical expertise is valuable, but it needs to be balanced with business judgment. I agree completely, Jade replied. I've learned that successful implementation requires buy-in from leadership, and that means ensuring proposals align with strategic priorities rather than just technological possibilities. Brennan stood and walked to the window overlooking the business district, feeling the satisfaction that came from mentoring a subordinate through a valuable learning experience. Ms. Kelloway, I hope you understand that last week's interaction was intended to help you develop professional skills that will serve you well throughout your career. Sometimes correction feels uncomfortable in the moment, but it's necessary for growth. I understand, sir, Jade said quietly. I realize my approach was inappropriate for the corporate environment, and I appreciate your guidance in helping me recognize those deficiencies. Excellent. Brennan turned back toward his desk, prepared to conclude the meeting with gracious authority. This revised proposal demonstrates exactly the kind of adaptability that successful employees need to develop. I'll review the documentation and provide feedback to help you refine it further. Actually, Director Brennan, there is one additional element I wanted to discuss. Jade's voice remained respectful, but something in her tone suggested a shift in the conversation's direction. Of course. What additional considerations do you have? Jade reached into her portfolio and withdrew a single sheet of paper, placing it on his desk with careful precision. I wanted to ensure you were aware of some background information that might affect the project timeline. Brennan glanced at the document and felt his confidence waver slightly. It appeared to be a federal compliance checklist related to data security protocols filled with technical language and regulatory references he didn't immediately understand. What exactly am I looking at here? He asked, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty for the first time during their conversation. These are compliance requirements for companies that process federal contractor data, Jade explained, her tone remaining helpful and professional. Given my security clearance and familiarity with these regulations, I thought it would be prudent to ensure Meridian's systems meet federal standards before implementing any upgrades. Brennan studied the document more carefully, recognizing enough of the language to understand that it dealt with serious regulatory requirements that could affect government contracts and federal business relationships. Are you suggesting our current systems don't meet these standards? I'm suggesting that federal compliance audits can be quite thorough when they occur, Jade replied carefully, particularly regarding vendor relationships, contract approval processes, and financial transparency requirements. Companies sometimes discover that practices they considered routine don't align with federal expectations. Something in her tone made Brennan look up from the document to study her expression more closely. What he saw there was not the deferent subordinate he'd been congratulating himself on mentoring. Instead, he glimpsed something that reminded him of documentaries he'd seen about military personnel, a kind of controlled intensity that suggested significant capabilities operating behind a carefully maintained facade. Ms. Kelloway, he said slowly, are you implying some kind of compliance problem with Meridian's operations? Not at all, sir, she replied, her voice remaining perfectly professional. I'm simply noting that federal auditors have extensive resources for analyzing corporate activities, and they're particularly interested in patterns that suggest conflicts of interest or irregularities in contract management. Brennan felt the first stirring of genuine unease. The conversation had shifted from his expected script into territory he didn't fully understand. What specific patterns are you referring to? Jade consulted her tablet again, then looked directly at him with eyes that seemed to be evaluating rather than deferring. Well, for example, repeated vendor selections that favor higher-cost providers despite competitive alternatives, or approval processes that bypass standard oversight mechanisms, or financial arrangements that create personal benefits for decision-makers. The temperature in the office seemed to drop several degrees. Brennan realized that this meeting was not unfolding as he'd anticipated, and that the woman sitting across from him was not the chastened subordinate he'd assumed he was addressing. "Ms. Kelloway," he said carefully, "what exactly are you trying to communicate to me?" For the first time since entering his office, Jade smiled. It was not a friendly expression. "Director Brennan," she said, "I'm trying to help you understand that some people remember more than you might expect them to, and some faces, once they've been touched inappropriately, become very motivated to ensure that appropriate consequences follow." In that moment, Kyle Brennan finally began to understand that he had made a very serious mistake about a very dangerous person. The silence in Kyle Brennan's office stretched like a wire under tension, broken only by the soft hum of climate control and the distant murmur of traffic 14 floors below. Brennan stared at Jade Kelloway across his mahogany desk, and for the first time in the conversation, he was seeing her clearly, not as the subordinate he'd expected to intimidate into compliance, not as the technical specialist he'd dismissed as socially awkward, but as something far more calculating and infinitely more dangerous. "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting," Brennan said, though his tone indicated he understood perfectly and was desperately hoping he was wrong. Jade reached into her portfolio again and withdrew a second document, this one bearing the letterhead of the Securities and Exchange Commission. She placed it beside the federal compliance checklist with the same deliberate precision she'd used for the first paper. "This is a summary of investigative protocols that the SEC uses when examining potential violations of federal contracting regulations," she said, her voice maintaining its helpful educational tone. "They're particularly interested in patterns that suggest systematic misuse of corporate resources for personal benefit." Brennan's eyes moved to the document despite himself. The language was dense with legal terminology and regulatory references, but certain phrases stood out with uncomfortable clarity: pattern analysis of vendor selection decisions, financial benefit correlation assessment, and executive accountability determination procedures. "Ms. Kelloway, I don't appreciate whatever game you think you're playing here," Brennan said, attempting to reclaim authority through volume. "If you have concerns about company operations, there are appropriate channels for addressing them." "Oh, I'm very familiar with appropriate channels," Jade replied, opening her tablet to display what appeared to be an organizational chart. "For instance, I know that board member Patricia Valdez chairs the audit committee and has expressed interest in ensuring Meridian's compliance with federal contractor requirements." She scrolled to a second screen showing email headers and timestamps. "I also know that Regional Manager Frank Castellanos has been concerned about vendor costs in his district, particularly regarding contractors who charge premium rates without competitive justification." Brennan felt his mouth go dry as he recognized names and situations that should not have been accessible to a technology department employee. "How do you have access to board-level communications?" "My security clearance provides access to various information systems," Jade explained matter-of-factly, "and my background includes training in data analysis and pattern recognition that most corporate employees don't possess." She turned the tablet toward him, displaying a network diagram that mapped financial relationships between Meridian's approved vendors, external consulting companies, and what appeared to be personal accounts linked to several executives. The connections were color-coded and annotated with dates, dollar amounts, and regulatory violation categories. This is what federal investigators would call a convergence pattern, Jade continued in the same helpful tone. It indicates systematic coordination between corporate decisions and personal financial benefit, the kind of pattern that typically results in criminal referrals rather than just civil penalties. Brennan stared at the screen, recognizing enough details to understand that someone had mapped his carefully concealed financial arrangements with devastating accuracy. Consulting fees from vendors who received Meridian contracts, speaking engagements at conferences sponsored by companies seeking regulatory approval, board positions at firms that benefited from Meridian's logistics partnerships. "Where did you get this information?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Public records mostly, corporate filings, conference disclosures, financial statements that are required by law for publicly traded companies." Jade scrolled through additional screens showing document sources and legal citations. It's remarkable how much information is available when someone knows where to look and how to analyze it systematically. She paused on a screen displaying what appeared to be audio waveform analysis. Of course, some information comes from internal sources, like security camera footage from corporate meetings, which includes audio recordings that can be enhanced and analyzed for content that might not be apparent during live observation. Brennan's face went pale as he understood the implication. "You recorded our conversation." "Actually, your office security system recorded our conversation. I simply have access to that system and the technical capability to ensure recordings meet legal standards for clarity and authentication." Jade closed the tablet and looked directly at him. "Just like it recorded last Friday's board meeting, where a senior executive physically assaulted an employee in front of 12 witnesses." The reality of his situation began crystallizing in Brennan's mind with horrifying clarity. The woman he'd slapped had not been intimidated into silence or frightened into submission. She had been gathering intelligence, building a case, and constructing a response that would destroy him professionally and potentially land him in federal prison. "What do you want?" he asked, abandoning any pretense of authority or control. "I want you to understand something very important about memory, Director Brennan," Jade said, standing and collecting her materials with unhurried precision. "When someone spends 8 years in Naval Special Warfare, they develop certain skills that don't disappear just because they change careers." She moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. "For instance, they learn to remember faces, not just what people look like, but who they really are beneath whatever mask they're wearing. They learn to recognize threats and neutralize them using whatever resources are available." Brennan watched her prepare to leave, understanding that his career, his freedom, and his future were walking out of his office in the hands of someone whose capabilities he had catastrophically underestimated. "They also learn patience," Jade continued, "how to gather intelligence systematically, build comprehensive cases, and wait for exactly the right moment to act. Military operations succeed because they leverage superior information against opponents who rely on conventional approaches." She opened the door, then turned back one final time. "And most importantly, they learn that some actions have consequences that can't be avoided, negotiated away, or covered up through corporate politics." The door closed behind her with the same soft finality that had characterized her exit from the board meeting 6 days earlier. But this time, Kyle Brennan understood exactly what was coming and how completely powerless he was to prevent it. Outside his office, the normal rhythms of corporate life continued unchanged. Phones rang, emails arrived, meetings proceeded according to schedule. But inside his corner office, Brennan sat alone with the knowledge that his world was about to end, dismantled by someone who had never forgotten a face and never forgiven a touch. The next morning, 3 federal agencies would receive anonymous tips about potential violations of contractor regulations at Meridian Industries. The audit committee would convene an emergency session to review vendor relationships and approval processes, and the security camera footage from conference room 12A would be enhanced, analyzed, and prepared for legal review. Kyle Brennan had learned too late that some people possessed capabilities that existed entirely outside the corporate systems he understood, and that when you chose to put your hands on the wrong person, the consequences could be measured in decades, rather than reprimands. Jade Kelloway walked back to her office with the satisfaction of someone who had just completed a successful mission. The target had been identified, analyzed, and neutralized using superior intelligence and strategic thinking. Justice, she reflected, was often just another word for superior preparation meeting opportunity at exactly the right moment. The federal agents arrived at Northridge Corporate Tower on Tuesday morning with the kind of quiet efficiency that turned routine business operations into historical artifacts. No sirens, no drama, just 3 black sedans in the visitor parking area, and a team of investigators who moved through the building's marble lobby with credentials that opened every door and silenced every objection. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez from the Securities and Exchange Commission led the team, accompanied by investigators from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division and the Defense Contract Audit Agency. Their search warrants were comprehensive, covering financial records, communications data, and personnel files dating back 3 years, precisely the period during which Kyle Brennan had been systematically exploiting his position for personal gain. By 9 a.m., the executive wing had been transformed into a federal crime scene. Agents methodically collected computers, files, and storage devices, while forensic accountants began analyzing financial transactions that painted a clear picture of corruption, fraud, and regulatory violations. The network diagram that Jade had shown Brennan served as their roadmap, guiding investigators to evidence that confirmed each connection and substantiated every allegation. Chairman Richard Ashworth found himself in the unprecedented position of explaining to federal agents how his company had failed to detect patterns of corruption that should have triggered internal audits years earlier. The board meeting he convened at 10 a.m. included 2 empty chairs. Kyle Brennan had failed to appear for work, and his assistant reported that his phone went directly to voicemail. The preliminary evidence suggests systematic violations of federal contractor regulations, Agent Martinez explained to the assembled board members. Multiple instances of conflict of interest, fraudulent vendor selection processes, and what appears to be organized conspiracy to defraud government entities. Patricia Valdez, serving as both legal counsel and audit committee chair, reviewed the federal warrant documents with growing alarm. Agent Martinez, what's the potential exposure for Meridian Industries as a corporate entity? That depends on the extent of institutional knowledge and complicity, Martinez replied. If this was individual misconduct by a single executive, corporate penalties might be manageable. If it reflects systemic failures of oversight and compliance, the consequences could include debarment from federal contracts and criminal charges against senior leadership. The investigation had been triggered by an anonymous tip that arrived simultaneously at 3 federal agencies on Monday evening. The tip included detailed financial analysis, documented evidence of regulatory violations, and audio recordings that provided context for the systematic nature of the corruption. Most importantly, it included enhanced security camera footage from corporate meetings that showed clear evidence of intimidation and retaliation against employees who had attempted to raise concerns about operational irregularities. While federal agents dissected Brennan's financial arrangements, Human Resources Director Amanda Foster was conducting her own investigation into the patterns of employee treatment that had enabled the corruption to flourish unchecked. The anonymous tip had included personnel records showing how employees who questioned vendor selections or raised compliance concerns had been systematically transferred, demoted, or forced to resign through hostile work environments. Foster's review revealed at least 6 instances over 2 years where employees had raised legitimate concerns about Brennan's decision-making, only to face retaliation that made continued employment untenable. The pattern suggested not just individual abuse, but institutional failure to protect whistleblowers and investigate potential misconduct. At 11:30 a.m., Foster knocked on the door of Jade Kelloway's 14th floor office. She found Jade calmly reviewing security protocols and updating system documentation, apparently unaffected by the federal investigation occurring 12 floors above her workspace. "Ms. Kelloway, I need to ask you some questions about recent events and your interactions with Director Brennan," Foster began, settling into the chair across from Jade's desk. "Of course," Jade replied, closing her laptop and giving Foster her complete attention. "How can I help?" "The federal investigation appears to have been triggered by very detailed information about financial irregularities and compliance violations, the kind of information that would require specialized knowledge and significant investigation resources to compile." Jade nodded thoughtfully. Federal agencies have extensive capabilities for analyzing corporate activities when they receive credible allegations of wrongdoing. "The timing is interesting," Foster continued. "The anonymous tip was submitted just 4 days after the incident in conference room 12A. That suggests someone had been monitoring Brennan's activities and was motivated by recent events to contact federal authorities." "That would make sense," Jade agreed. "Sometimes people observe patterns of concerning behavior, but need a specific incident to understand the full scope of the problem they're witnessing." Foster studied Jade's expression, recognizing the careful neutrality of someone who was providing truthful answers while avoiding unnecessary details. "Ms. Kelloway, do you have any knowledge of how federal investigators obtained such comprehensive information about Brennan's financial activities?" "Amanda, my security clearance provides familiarity with federal compliance requirements and investigative procedures," Jade replied. "When someone with that background observes potential violations of federal contractor regulations, they understand the appropriate channels for reporting concerns." And the audio recordings that were included with the anonymous tip. Security camera footage that had been enhanced and analyzed with sophisticated software. Jade's expression remained professionally neutral. "The building's security systems record all corporate meetings for legal compliance purposes. If federal investigators requested that footage and had it analyzed by their technical teams, that would be standard procedure for this type of investigation." Foster leaned back in her chair, understanding that she was speaking with someone who had carefully considered every aspect of the situation and prepared responses that were accurate without being incriminating. "Ms. Kelloway, I want to ensure that Meridian Industries learns from this situation and implements procedures that prevent similar problems in the future. Do you have recommendations for improving our oversight and compliance systems?" "I think the current investigation will provide valuable insights into areas where our procedures need strengthening," Jade replied. "Federal agencies are quite thorough in their analysis of corporate governance failures and their recommendations for remediation." By noon, Kyle Brennan's corner office had been stripped of computers, files, and personal belongings. Federal investigators had seized materials that documented 3 years of systematic corruption, including evidence that would support criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, and violations of federal contractor regulations. Brennan himself remained missing, though federal agents had issued arrest warrants and coordinated with local law enforcement to locate him. His financial accounts had been frozen, his assets were subject to forfeiture proceedings, and his professional reputation was destroyed beyond any possibility of rehabilitation. At 2 p.m., Chairman Ashworth convened an emergency board meeting to address the crisis and begin damage control efforts. The agenda included immediate suspension of all vendor contracts pending compliance review, implementation of enhanced oversight procedures, and cooperation with ongoing federal investigations. We need to understand how this situation developed and ensure it never happens again, Ashworth told the assembled board members. The federal investigation will determine legal consequences, but we have a responsibility to examine our own failures of oversight and accountability. Patricia Valdez had been reviewing personnel files throughout the morning, trying to understand how warning signs had been missed and legitimate concerns had been ignored. Richard, I think we need to acknowledge that this wasn't just individual misconduct. It was enabled by institutional failures to protect employees who tried to raise concerns. What do you recommend? Enhanced whistleblower protections, independent oversight of vendor selection processes, and mandatory training on federal compliance requirements for all senior executives. Valdez paused, then added, and I think we should recognize that some of our employees possess expertise that we haven't been utilizing effectively. Meanwhile, in her 14th floor office, Jade Kelloway continued updating security protocols and preparing implementation plans for the facial recognition upgrade that would now proceed without budgetary obstacles. The federal investigation had eliminated the corruption that had threatened Meridian's regulatory compliance, while removing the executive who had used intimidation to suppress legitimate concerns about operational integrity. Justice, she reflected, was often just superior preparation meeting opportunity at exactly the right moment, and some faces, once they had been touched inappropriately, possessed very long memories and very sophisticated capabilities for ensuring appropriate consequences. The system had corrected itself with precision that would have impressed her former special operations commanders. 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Conference Room 12A, illuminating a space that had been completely transformed. The same mahogany table remained, the same leather chairs surrounded it, but the energy in the room carried none of the tension that had characterized that gray Friday when everything changed. Instead, there was the focused calm of an organization that had learned hard lessons about accountability, oversight, and the true meaning of professional respect. Jade Kelloway stood at the front of the room again, but this time her title had changed. The nameplate on the table before her read, Director of Corporate Security and Compliance, a position that had been created specifically to ensure that the failures exposed by the federal investigation could never recur. Her presentation screen displayed metrics that would have been impossible to achieve under the previous regime. 0 vendor compliance violations, 100% federal audit scores, and a whistleblower protection program that had become a model for other corporations in their industry. The board members who filled the seats around the table were mostly familiar faces, though several had been replaced following the comprehensive governance review that federal investigators had recommended. Chairman Richard Ashworth remained, his leadership validated by his decisive response to the crisis and his commitment to systemic reform. Patricia Valdez had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer, her legal expertise and institutional integrity proving invaluable during the months of federal cooperation and compliance restructuring. The facial recognition system integration is now complete across all 7 facilities, Jade reported, her voice carrying the same measured professionalism that had characterized her presentations before the storm, but now backed by unquestioned authority and institutional respect. Processing accuracy exceeds 99.8%. False positive rates have been eliminated entirely, and the system has successfully flagged 47 individuals on federal watch lists who attempted to access our facilities using fraudulent credentials. Board member Linda Chen, who had witnessed the original slap and become one of Jade's strongest advocates during the restructuring process, nodded approvingly. Director Kelloway, can you walk us through the cost savings we've achieved through the vendor compliance improvements? Jade clicked to the next slide, displaying financial data that demonstrated the economic impact of eliminating corruption from corporate decision-making. The competitive bidding process has reduced vendor costs by 37%, while improving service quality across all categories. We estimate that the previous irregularities cost Meridian approximately $12 million over 3 years, not including the legal fees and federal penalties associated with the compliance violations. The numbers were impressive, but they represented only the quantifiable benefits of the transformation. What couldn't be measured as easily was the change in corporate culture that had emerged from the ashes of Kyle Brennan's regime. Employees no longer feared retaliation for raising legitimate concerns. Vendor selection processes operated with transparency and accountability. Federal contract compliance had become a source of competitive advantage rather than regulatory risk. The enhanced security protocols have also improved our competitive position for federal contracts, Jade continued. We've been pre-qualified for 3 Department of Defense logistics projects that require top-level security clearances and compliance certifications. The revenue potential exceeds $50 million over the next 2 years. What the board members didn't know, and what Jade would never mention, was that her background had opened doors that pure corporate credentials could never have accessed. Military procurement officers trusted Meridian's security protocols because they recognized the expertise behind them. Federal contracting authorities fast-tracked compliance approvals because they understood the caliber of oversight that former special operations personnel brought to corporate environments. Kyle Brennan's fate had been sealed with surgical precision. Federal prosecutors had built an airtight case using the evidence that anonymous tips had provided, resulting in a plea agreement that included 18 months in federal prison, complete financial restitution, and permanent debarment from corporate leadership positions. The investigation had revealed corruption totaling nearly $15 million, involving 6 other companies and resulting in criminal charges against 11 additional executives. But, perhaps more importantly, the case had become a textbook example of how systematic corruption could be exposed and prosecuted using advanced analytical techniques and comprehensive investigation methods. Business schools now taught case studies about the Meridian Industries investigation, though they focused on corporate governance failures rather than the specialized skills that had made the exposure possible. Jade's career transformation had been as dramatic as the company's rehabilitation. Her promotion to director had come with salary increases, expanded responsibilities, and recognition throughout the industry as an expert in corporate security and federal compliance. She'd been invited to speak at conferences, consulted with other companies facing similar challenges, and recruited by competitors offering even more lucrative positions. But she'd chosen to remain at Meridian, partly because the work was professionally satisfying, partly because she believed in the organization's commitment to reform, and partly because she'd created something that couldn't be replicated elsewhere. The security and compliance system she'd built were customized to her specific expertise and operational background. Leaving would mean abandoning capabilities that had taken years to develop and integrate into corporate structures. Finally, Jade said, advancing to her last slide, I want to acknowledge the support this board has provided during the transition period. Implementing these changes required difficult decisions and significant investments, but the results demonstrate that ethical operations and operational excellence are not just compatible. They're mutually reinforcing. Chairman Ashworth stood as she concluded, leading applause that felt genuine rather than obligatory. Director Kelloway, I think I speak for the entire board when I say that Meridian Industries is fortunate to have someone of your caliber and integrity in this critical role. Your leadership during this challenging period has been exemplary. After the board members filed out, Jade remained in the conference room for a few moments, looking through the windows at the Northridge business district spreading toward the Pacific horizon. The view was identical to what she'd seen 6 months ago, but everything else had changed fundamentally. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Webb, her former Navy intelligence colleague who had provided crucial assistance during the investigation. Saw the news about Meridian's federal contract awards. Congratulations on the vindication. Some targets take longer to neutralize than others, but the important thing is completing the mission. Jade smiled and typed back, Mission accomplished. Thanks for the support when it mattered. She gathered her materials and walked toward the elevator, passing employees who nodded respectfully and colleagues who sought her expertise on complex problems. The quiet tech specialist who had once been dismissed as socially awkward had become one of the most respected executives in the building, but not through traditional corporate climbing or political maneuvering. Instead, she had demonstrated that some capabilities transcended organizational hierarchies, that some people possessed resources that couldn't be controlled or intimidated, and that justice sometimes required patience, precision, and the strategic application of superior intelligence. As the elevator descended toward the parking garage, Jade reflected on a lesson that Kyle Brennan had learned too late. When you choose to lay hands on someone, you better make sure you understand exactly who you're touching and what kind of capabilities they might possess. Some faces, once marked by inappropriate contact, never forget. And some people, when properly motivated, possess the skills and resources to ensure that appropriate consequences follow with mathematical precision. The system had corrected itself not through corporate procedures or legal protections, but through the strategic application of specialized capabilities that existed entirely outside conventional frameworks. And sometimes that was exactly what justice looked like in the real world. Would you trust someone who slapped a former Navy SEAL to face no consequences? Do you think corporate bullies understand the difference between submission and strategic patience? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story showed you what real professional justice looks like, smash that like button and make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you never miss our next operation. Share this with someone who needs to understand that quiet competence often defeats loud arrogance when the stakes are real. Our next mission is already queued up on your screen. Go check it out now, and I'll see you in the next story where we explore what happens when people underestimate the wrong person at exactly the wrong moment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.